Hello there, I'm Jason Ball, and this is Life After News. Today, my guest is Tom Skilling. If you've ever watched TV in Chicago, you know who Tom is. He was the meteorologist at WGN for 45 years. He retired a year and a half ago. I caught up with him recently at his vacation home in Hawaii, and today you're going to learn a lot. It's a great lesson in weather forecasting, and the importance of weather science. The legendary Tom Skilling is my guest today. Thank you so much for taking some time out of your busy post news life.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Jason, and nice to meet you by way of our Zoom link here. Good to see you.
Nice to see you. So, you've been retired for a year and a half?
Yes.
How is your life after news?
You know, I wondered about it. I think I fought with the decision to retire for about 2.5, 3 years. You always wonder, am I financially set? Is this the time to do it? What am I going to do with myself? Because I had been a workaholic. I'd started 8 in the morning at home and going to the station at 3 in the afternoon, having done all my research and model work, and then would work till 11 o'clock at night. So my days were 12 to 14 hours, and I thought, boy, I wonder just what life after retirement is going to be like. Let me tell you, it's been great. I've been having a lot of fun, and far from not having things to do, I find I'm keeping myself very busy. I've been involved in climate conferences. I continue to work with WGN with part-time work. We do special reports. I've done one on the big exascale computer at Argonne Labs. I worked with a commercial airline pilot, a 37-year veteran of United Airlines, to inform our viewers how it is these commercial airline pilots brief themselves on the weather they're going to encounter. And I've been skydiving. I did a piece with our reporter Jackie Bank on that. She'd been after me for years to skydive. And when I announced my retirement, she poked her head in the weather office out there at WGN and said, "Oh, congratulations." And I kiddingly, with a producer with whom I'd been working on a story at the time Jackie poked her head in, I kiddingly said to Jackie, "Well, now with all this time I've got on my hands, I can start skydiving." Kidding, of course. And yet I saw two sets of eyes light up with peripheral vision and looking at Jackie in front of me, and I realized I had unwittingly committed to a sweeps piece on skydiving, and wasn't sure whether or not I do that or not. But I'll tell you, Jason, having predicted the atmosphere my entire life over a half a century, the notion of falling through it 2.5 miles was kind of intriguing to me. I thought, I wonder what that'll feel like. And we've all had those dreams when we're falling in our dreams from an airplane or something. Well, it turned out to be nothing like that. But let me tell you, I'm glad they pushed me out the door quickly because when you are up at 14,000 feet, looking at the world below and realizing there's no airplane between you, infrastructure around you, there's nothing between you and the ground you're looking at below, you do for a moment think, maybe this wasn't the smartest thing to do, but it turned out to be absolutely fascinating. It really was.
That's cool. I always say, why jump out of a perfectly good airplane?
That's what people wrote me and said that when they found out I was doing that, and there's truth to that. There definitely is.
Was it exhilarating, or what was it like?
Do you know what? I think I laid in bed in the 2 weeks that followed that, analyzing exactly what my response to it was. You fall at 140 miles an hour for about 60 seconds down to from 14,000 to 6,000 feet, and then you're jerked all of a sudden as the parachute opens. And I was doing it tandem, so I had somebody who really knew what they were doing. And it's interesting, Jason, the air rushing by you, you couldn't, imagine carrying on a conversation. But once that parachute opened, we were thousands of feet above the ground. You're looking at semis moving on the interstates below you and all the rest from thousands of feet aloft. And we carried on a lovely conversation on the rest of the way down. So, and it was interesting. We had smoke off the Canadian wildfires blowing in. It had been we'd had these beautiful sunrises and sunsets. We've had smoke from California, from your neck of the woods and from the west. in many years. This year it was Canadian wildfire smoke at the time. You can't smell it down at the ground, and yet the minute I left that airplane, it was clear I was smelling the Canadian wildfire smoke that had blown in from thousands of miles away. And so it was
Wow.
interesting. I'm still analyzing it, but I'm glad I did it. I really am.
Well, that's good. Would
Yeah.
you do it again?
You know what? When I was out there, I come out to Hawaii now. I moved back and forth between Chicago and Hawaii. Never expected to be doing that. And one of the people at the skydiving place said, "Hey, I went skydiving in Hawaii. There's a place right up the highway. I'm on the Big Island here. And there's a place up the highway where I guess they do it. And I have got the thoughts kind of crossed my mind that it would be kind of interesting to do that out here in Hawaii amid the
Yeah.
volcanoes and the beautiful Pacific and so forth."
Well, Hawaii is perfect for a weather geek, I guess,
Yeah.
because you have so many all the microclimates, even just on the Big Island there, because you're on the leeward side, right?
The Koala Coast, yes. I'm up here on the northwest side. And of course, the leeward sides of the islands are dry and the windward sides are wet, this being a region of tropical easterlies. So the prevailing wind is in from the east. The minute it hits terrain, you get what we call in the meteorological profession speed convergence and orographic lifting. Terrain lifts the air to condensation, and you'll get clouds and rain to form on the east side. And then as the air descends on the west sides of the islands, there's a drying effect that goes on. And it's kind of like what happens out your way when the Santa Anas blow. The air descends, these katabatic winds coming out of the mountains. They compress, warm, and dry in the process. And of course, that led to the Lahaina tragedy, where the whole town burned down in the middle of the night during these strong winds that blow out here at times. It really a tragic situation.
Well, we're recording this on July 15th, and it's a big weather day. It's the 20th anniversary of the heat wave in Chicago,
Yes.
and then it's also raining torrentially in New York right now. So do you miss
Yeah.
those days?
And we're only several weeks removed from the July 4th debacle down in Texas, which, of course, with the discussion about FEMA's future and what they're doing, this current administration, to funding our NOAA, the National Weather Service, and science in general in this country is really worrisome. I mean, we seem to be ceding our incredible scientific leadership to the Chinese, to India, and to Europeans. Foolish cuts by people who probably have never been in a weather office, we're trying to figure out how it is they decide who they're letting go. It looks like there's kind of a meat axe approach to the way they handle this. Foolish, because the advances I've seen in meteorology over the last 50 years are stunning. It's beyond argument that the progress made in forecasting the weather in the last 70 years eclipses everything that had come before it, going back to 340 BC when Aristotle wrote his first treatise on meteorology. It was called Meteorologica, and it is widely regarded as the beginning of meteorology as a science. He had everything wrong, but at least he was trying to approach the
figure it
science
out.
of meteorology in an organized fashion. Yeah.
So, I mean, I understand you were a little unsure of when this whole climate change notion came about. You were a little skeptical, which I appreciate.
Yeah.
Always being skeptical of things in the beginning and trying to figure it out. So, what was the turning point for you?
As a young forecaster, I would read about the Arctic melting, the ice in the Arctic, and I thought, wow, the physics of that, how is that going to work? I mean, just the nature of sunlight falling on our planet, you would think you would preserve ice in the northern regions. But then it became very clear to me how logically this was going to happen. And it's just experience, watching what's been evolving. There's nothing like, watching meteorological and climatological anomalies and trying to understand how and why they're occurring to convince you that there really is something going on here. There's no doubt in my mind. And I'll tell you though, having that evolution in thought is really helpful, because when you encounter climate deniers, you kind of realize maybe some of their thought process in questioning the science, which no longer, there's not a shred of doubt in my mind that we are watching our climate undergoing stunning changes. And we're doing it in an entirely different measure, for entirely different reasons than, say, the climate changes that brought on the last ice ages. Our planet, the orbit around the sun changes its shape. And the periodicity, the cycle occurs over tens of thousands of years. The astronomer Milankovitch is the guy who first identified that. We also wobble as a planet on our axis. We're about 23.5 degrees different than being perpendicular to the plane of the sunlight coming in right now. But that wobble has taken the orientation of our planet's axis anywhere from 21 degrees to 25 degrees. So combine going into a more oblong rather than circular shaped orbit that takes us away from sun at a greater distance at certain times of the years. Marry that to a tilt that is accentuated, a 25-degree tilt instead of the 23.5. And the bottom line is you change the amount of sunlight that's falling on the surface, and therefore the way the planet is heating, and the ice sheets begin growing and going on. What's happening now is we're literally altering the chemistry of the atmosphere with these greenhouse gases that we throw into it. And gases like methane and carbon dioxide have a property of holding on to and re-radiating heat. Well, all weather on Earth is driven by differential heating. The fact one area warms up more than another one. If you start fiddling with the way the planet is warming up, you change the jet streams and all that steer the storms and bring the moisture into the area or deny it in certain cases. And you also, by heating the planet, increase the amount of moisture that occurs in the atmosphere. So what you wind up with is extremes on all ends of the climatological and meteorological spectrum. The dries get drier, the wets get wetter, the storm tracks change. Areas that were used to rain are not getting them all of a sudden. And that becomes a real issue if you're worrying about producing food.
In your opinion, what can be done, or is it just about forecasting the weather better and preparing, or are there other things that we can do?
Well, adaptation is going, we've got so much carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the pipeline that if we stopped burning fossil fuel tomorrow, we would continue warming with the gas currently in the atmosphere. So this is not something that we're going to be able to solve overnight. And you can see from the unwillingness of the current administration to develop renewable sources of energy, they're doing everything they can to set us back terribly in our production of renewable energy.
You've really taken that Chicago community on that dive into science, weather as a science.
Jason, you as a former news director will appreciate this. I mean, I used to terrify the news consultants. I remember sitting across the table from them and they'd say, oh, they're too complex. And all your viewers, they want to know is it going to rain and what the temperature is going to be tomorrow? That's the way weather people were put down, and they tried to muzzle us and quiet us. But the fact is, they were dead wrong about that. They underestimate the intelligence of our viewers. And upon retirement, the thing that I hear across the board from everybody is you're so busy doing it at the time, you don't hear this while you're actually involved in the profession, but you tend to hear more after you retire. They said, the thing we like about your weather show is you explained to us what was going on. They underestimate the intelligence of the viewers. I mean, we watch news programs and we are fascinated by investigative journalism and all the rest because we want to understand what's going on in our world. And I could never quite figure out why weather, which affects us all in one way or another throughout our lives, would be viewed as any different in an investigation on why the weather is occurring. When we're telling people we've got a snowstorm that's going to cripple the city coming in, or a flood or a tornado outbreak, what's wrong with sharing with them some of your thought process and arriving at the conclusion that you're going to have a potentially catastrophic weather event taking place? I never quite understood that. But I'm fortunate, having worked at WGN, um, the people there were wonderful. And I always used to kid and say, you know, you made the mistake. You allowed me on the air long enough to develop something of a following, and now, now it's too late to shut the old boy down, you know, and quiet him, muzzle him.
That's
So it was great. But I'll tell you, I've been interested in the weather since I was a little kid. I find it absolutely fascinating. I find its reach into our lives on so many different levels profound. And it's been fun to have a career where I've watched the science advance in ways I couldn't have imagined. And at the same time, um, being able to share that with people, with my viewers and all. It was a lot of fun. And
Did you really start at 14 at a radio station in Aurora, Illinois?
yes, right. Yeah, you know what happened? I, I was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I only lived there 2 years. My folks are natives of Western Pennsylvania. My dad then was transferred to New York City and commuted into New York every day, and we lived in New Jersey. So I had an interest in the weather, and I used to keep my weather readings and all. And I remember in fifth grade, my birthday present was to go into the United States Weather Bureau at Rockefeller Center, home of NBC, and to see the Weather Bureau office there. And I can remember I'd keep my high and low temperatures and my precip and all as a kid, and I would duplicate them, put them in an envelope, and send them to the United States Weather Bureau, Washington, D.C. That was the only address I knew. And you know, Jason, it was amazing. I'd get a letter back. And it's the reason I love our weather service. They enable and encourage so many young careers. They would send a letter back and say, "Now, Mr. Skilling, nice job on keeping track of the weather, but we really don't need information in your area. But keep up the great work." And to get a letter like that from somebody in Washington D.C. you'd never met before, and for them to have taken the time to sit down and send a young kid a letter like that. Anyway, when we moved from New Jersey, I was in the seventh grade in 1965 out to Aurora, Illinois. My dad was transferred out there. He was a mechanical engineer by trade, sold huge industrial valves to power plants and water treatment facilities. Had nobody in my family had anything to do with the weather. My parents couldn't figure out what they'd done wrong to have a kid so taken by meteorology. In fact, I remember I was going into Chicago with my mother, and I was always concerned that they did not approve of me going toward a meteorological career, and I could never quite figure out why. But we were going in for a doctor's appointment, so I said, "Mom, let's stop by the National Weather Service office in the federal building there, and I'll show you." And I thought, oh, when she sees the maps on the wall and hears the teletypes clacking and all, she's going to think, well, maybe he's not wrong. This looks kind of exciting. So we go in, and the people there at the office are lovely and show us around. And I walk out of the office with her, and I said, "Well, now, Mom, what do you think about, a meteorological career?" And she said to me, "If you work in an office like that, I'll die 1,000 deaths the rest of my life." And I remember thinking, well, so much for that effort. But
That didn't go the way I was planned.
no, it didn't. But I'll tell you something. My parents were wonderful. When they realized for whatever reason their kid was weather crazy, they supported me, and it's just been amazing to be in broadcasting. I'm sure you would say the same thing, Jason. I mean, we really have a unique view of the front seat view of the world and the newsmakers that are involved and everything else. It's so important communicating to people. The fourth estate has never been more important than it is today.
100%.
Knowing what these folks are doing who represent us.
But I want to know how you talk these people into putting a 14-year-old boy on the radio to do the weather.
Oh, well, here's what happened. So I moved out there, and in those days, you had no internet. A kid interested in the weather
Right.
either cut these lousy weather maps they had in newspapers out. The New York Times had a really good one, and the Newark Evening News had a really good weather map. The Newark Evening News would give you the 1 a.m. weather map from that day, and the New York Times, which my teachers would get at school, gave you the 1 p.m. surface weather map for the day before. So between the two of them, I had like two weather maps, and then I subscribed to a publication from Washington, D.C. It was called the Daily Weather Map, It came out of the superintendent of documents office. And I remember I had paper routes, and I would pay $9 a year to have the map sent from Washington to New Jersey by email. But when we moved out to Aurora, and by the way, this publication included an upper air chart, which was available through no other means. I used to look at the weather maps, and they show you the current map, and then they have a little insert map that says, here's what the weather map will look like tomorrow. And I thought, how do they know that this front that doesn't have a storm on it is going to develop a storm? And I thought, well, it must have something to do with the jet stream or the upper air. And this is one place I could get an upper air map from this publication out of Washington. Well, when I moved to Aurora, that publication arrived instead of the next day, the way it did in New Jersey, 4 days later. So I sat down and wrote what I'm told was an 8-page letter to the local radio station, thinking a radio station could do anything, and said, look, I had the audacity to suggest that I'll give you a better weather forecast for Aurora, 40 miles west of Chicago, than you're getting out of Chicago if you'll get me some weather maps. So, I look back on that, I think, boy, the audacity of a 14-year-old kid to suggest he could do a better forecast than was coming out of Chicago. But the program director called up, and I remember coming home from school one afternoon, and my mother said, some radio station just called for you. What's that all about? And I had to come clean what I had done, because I knew if I told my parents I was writing them a letter to try and get, they would have said, for God's sake, you're a 14-year-old kid. These people have more important things to do than respond to you. But I set it off, and they did respond to me, and we drove into the then Weather Bureau. It became the National Weather Service in 1970. And we talked to the head of the office there. And I said, look, I'm trying to get weather maps. And he said, well, we normally don't do that. But he said, I'll tell you what, we hand plot a lot of stuff. This is pre-computer model era in meteorology in the 1960s. We hand plot stuff. We have a big Bruning architects like reproduction machine, because they'll plot a map out. 3 forecasters will plot maps, and then they duplicate it for the marine desk, the aviation desk, and the public desk. And we'll run a copy off if you pay for the reproduction costs. Well, the radio station said they do that. And then we sent them self-addressed stamped envelopes, special delivery envelopes. And I found out later there were 2 sets of weather maps like this that were sent out of the Chicago National Weather Service office. One went to Argonne National Laboratory, and the other one went to Tom Skilling. And some of the guys who later worked with us when we started doing the Chicago Tribune page, I brought some of the Weather Service folks in after they retired to help us with that. And one of the guys was the guy who packed up these maps every day. And he said, we always used to say in the office, we understood Argonne Labs getting it, but who is this Skilling character that and they didn't know it was a 14-year-old kid. But there's another case, Jason, where a Weather Service office profoundly affects the career of a young person. And you've seen it. You've entertained it, when you were news director, young people who want to come in and see how a TV newsroom works. And the way I went in, I used to visit John Coleman and Harry Volkman were the 2 big weather people in Chicago. And that meant the world to me. I get on the train when other kids were going to a ball game, and I go down to the University of Chicago where they had the forecast office. And that to me was like dying and going, coming to life at a candy store. It was just fascinating. So that's how that happened.
So, okay, let's fast forward like a dozen years later, and you went to college and you continued your meteorology education. And then you ended up on WGN in Chicago, where you say Chicago is the Broadway for the weather geeks world, because the weather is so diverse there.
I've got to give credit for that line from John Coleman. John Coleman said about Chicago, it's Broadway for weathermen. And I thought, what a great expression, because we've got everything there.
I'd never been to Chicago until I became the news director at KTLA, and we were obviously owned by Tribune Company.
Yes.
And the first time I went was in February, and everything was covered in ice.
Oh, God.
And the second time I came was in September, and it was so windy you could barely walk down Michigan Avenue.
Yeah.
And then the third time I came was in June. I'm like, this is amazing.
It
This is the
really
most amazing place ever.
It really is. And, you know, and of course, it's probably the reason people take the weather quite seriously in places like that. I mean, they know it can kill them. It can cause it can affect their commute to work, the way they dress. You know, studies have shown the way medicines work, our psychology, it's all linked to the weather. So there are profound impacts of the weather on our lives. And but you really see it. I always say the only thing we don't have in Chicago is hurricanes.
So when you started at WGN in 1978,
Yes.
did you? What did you think? Did you think you would be there for 45 years? What were you? What was in your mind in those early days?
Ian called and said, "Look, we got a proposition. Would you come down and do our weekend weather shows? And there may be, no guarantee, but there may be a job if this works out all right at the other end of this." So I wasn't going to do it. I was young. I was only 26 or something. And I called John Coleman and I said, "John, I'm not ready for Chicago." And he said, "Nonsense." He said, "They've been looking for a year. You're the first one I've ever heard that they've even reached out to. You do it." So I went down, was terrified, and I did the 2 shows on the weekend. And they called me on Monday and said, would you like a full-time job?" And that's how I started at WGN. And it was interesting because WGN at the time was owned by the Tribune Company, who had, of course, the Chicago Tribune, and the Supreme Court was ruling on whether a newspaper company could keep a broadcast operation in the same market. So the bottom line was, until that ruling came down, they weren't sure that they might have to spin WGN off, and they spent no money on equipment. So we were still shooting news on film. We had very limited chroma key capabilities, which I'd use to show my weather maps up in Milwaukee. And but I went to work at WGN, and I remember John Coleman telling me, he said they're going to become what's called a superstation. And I knew nothing about superstations. We were pre-CNN, pre-WTBS, pre-HBO. That was only starting to come on the scene back in those days. But sure enough, they put us on the satellite, and our shows were distributed across the country. And when the Supreme Court ruling came down saying grandfather clausing newspapers owning existing TV stations, the wallet opened up, and overnight they were installing equipment. I remember Phil Donahue came to fame at WGN on in the control room, there was a little homemade 8-button switcher. That was it. And I remember coming from a sophisticated station in Milwaukee that had state-of-the-art equipment. I thought, this is the big time? It's really amazing to me how far behind things are down here. But I love the people, and I love the station. They weren't real enamored of me. And I remember I'd be called by the general manager and saying, now, there was opening day at the ballpark the next day, and he said, now, his secretary would call and say, "What's your forecast for tomorrow?" And I said, "Oh, brother, 40 degrees, we're going to have gale force winds. I don't think they're going to play that opening game." She said, "All right." And she hung up, and 3 seconds later, the boss calls me, the general manager, and said, "Now, what's that forecast?" He called everybody Senator. He said, "What's that forecast like tomorrow, Senator?" And I said, "Well, Mr. Picaro," I said, "looks like it's going to be a lot of rain and cold. And I'd be surprised if..." He said, "Oh, no, Senator, come on back and see me." So I went back to the office, and he said, "Now, what I want you to do tonight, you're to wear a ball cap, bring a baseball bat onto the set and swing it and say, that weather tomorrow is going to be great." And I thought, my God, I'm being told to ignore all the evidence. And by the way, the next day it was 40 degrees. The rain came down horizontally. It was horrible. And they didn't play the game. But I went on that night thinking, well, this may be the career too. I just left Milwaukee under crazy circumstances. I thought, this is all I need is to be fired here because I'm predicting rain for opening day for the White Sox. And so I got on the air and I said, I'm hoping something changes. We've got wind and rain and 40 degrees tomorrow, but maybe we'll be lucky and the forecast will change. That was the only way I could think of handling it. And so I, I don't know. There were rumors that they were not happy with me. In fact, they hired Jim Ramsey, and my news director at the time, Paul Davis, who you probably know, Jason. He told me, he said, he said the higher ups were saying get rid of this kid and bring Ramsey in, and he said I'm the one who said give the kid a chance, and he said so I protected your job. And I thanked him for that, and the rest is history. I made it through. But and not only
Well,
made it through, we have a very loyal weather following.
what was the turning point where you really made that change and solidified your audience and really,
You
I mean,
know,
I know it's because you really communicated with the audience and you told them the truth.
yeah. It took several years, and there would be, reports from critics in the suburban newspapers that maybe my days were numbered and all the rest. And I don't know where that would come from, but I took it seriously. And I remember Paul Davis would tell me that his wife had a master's degree and she wished there was a ding, ding, ding just before the forecast came up because everything, all the maps and all, she wasn't interested in. And I remember one day I said, after 2 years of this, I said, well, Paul, who runs this place, you or your wife? And I am knowing that this could get me fired. But he said, well, can't you take criticism? And I said, Paul, I said, all I get from you is criticism. I said, so what I did, he said, I'll call you a liar if you ever tell anybody I said this to you, but you need representation. So I called Don Ephraim, who represented Siskel and Ebert and Bill Curtis and all. And I didn't know anything about having representation. And I said to him, Mr. Ephraim, I said, I'm Tom Skilling at WGN. I'm wondering if you would represent me. Oh, yeah. He said, come on down and we'll talk. Well, the world changed after that. And I said to him, all the criticism stopped. And I said, Don, what did you do? I said, it's like the criticism has gone away. He said, I just told them if they're unhappy with you, I'll find you another home here because there'll be other stations happy to take you. And so at any rate, that was when it stopped. And really, the majority of my time at WGN, which was a fascinating television station. I mean,
45 years. I mean, that was unheard of.
Well, Jason, you work for KTLA. I mean, these are historic television stations with amazing histories. They literally have helped mold our profession, the whole broadcast industry. These are history-rich stations. I mean, Donahue came to fame at our place. We had Bozo the Clown. We had a morning show that dominated.
What I also appreciate about your career is that you really are about educating the public on the science of the weather. Tell me a little bit about the Fermilabs.
Oh, yeah. Boy, you've done your homework, Jason. You've done your homework on this. You know, when I get into explaining to people some of the reasoning, I think the reason I did, because I found it kind of fascinating, and I thought maybe the viewer will find this interesting, how we arrive at this, or why my forecast is a little different than maybe some other ones they're hearing. And I think it's interesting to share with people what the science is behind it, or the thinking, and people seem to appreciate that. I'll tell you what happened on that Fermilab tornado seminar. We have tornadoes in the Midwest, and they're devastating. And so I always would go out to schools and talk. And whenever I talked about tornadoes and severe weather, that was the students, you had their attention immediately. And Fermilab got wind of it. And the fellow I did it with, Brian Smith, who started, he was an NIU student. He called me up and said, hey, Tom, how about us doing a tornado seminar for the public? And I said, Brian, let's do it. Well, we would do this every year, and we had a veritable who's who of the tornado research and severe weather research and forecast community come through. We had the head of the Weather Service, the director of the Storm Prediction Center, NASA people, National Severe Storms Laboratory people coming in and would talk about Doppler radar and the developments that are going on there. And to our surprise, thousands showed up at these things every year. Fermilab said it was the biggest attendance on any event they ever did in this facility. And they were wonderful. It was a perfect forum and venue. It was so amazing to have weather colleagues that you normally don't work with in a TV weather office joining us there and talking about what they were doing. And I always thought one of our functions as weather people on media, mass media, is to be liaisons between the research community and the public, who, after all, through taxpayer funds, are research, funding a lot of this research that's going on. And there's such mythology. You see it in the climate change issue, that these guys are getting rich off grants and that this is all political and all the rest. And these are the least political people, the most apolitical people I've ever run into. And I wanted people to see that. These are not raving libtards, as there's some, or anything like that. These are scientists who are worried about their grandchildren, the world that they're going to, leave them, and all the rest. So it was fascinating, and we did that for 38 years, and year after year. And I remember when I invited Ted Fujita, he says there must be 500 people here. And I said, "Oh, Dr. Fujita, there are 1,000 in this auditorium, and they're closed circuiting it to lecture halls throughout Fermilab, where we're putting up the other people, the overflow crowd." So I said, see the crowd that you attract? And we had a terrible tornado in Plainfield, Illinois, the year before his visit there. And he pioneered the overflight of tornado areas. You can see damage arrays that from the air more clearly than you can in the chaos down at the ground at times. He, for instance, was the one who noticed that tornadoes, we used to think tornadoes skipped along the ground, and that was why one area was damaged and another area wouldn't be, and then it'd be damaged again. We found out what was really going on there are vortices spinning around the larger tornado vortex that are doing damage. They effectively produce winds 100 miles per hour faster than the big tornado vortex itself. And so if your house was under one of these little vortices, it was more apt to be destroyed. And, this is the kind of thing we could discuss with people and show them how the scientists arrived at these conclusions. So his Fujita scale, we call it the enhanced Fujita scale, was in and of itself amazing. He designed it so that there were 10 levels of intensity from 0 to Mach 1, the speed of sound. And, he always had a rationale for everything he came up with, which was brilliant. And he also was brilliant at visualizing things. A lot of his funding came from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, from the airlines. He was the one who came up with the downburst microburst notion. And he was told at the time he did it that he was crazy. But he had been called in by Eastern Airlines to investigate the terrible JFK plane crash that killed hundreds at JFK Airport in 1975. There were subsequent wind shear-related plane crashes in New Orleans and Dallas-Fort Worth that he was called in on to investigate. And he spent his summers out on the Front Range of the Rockies investigating the thunderstorms there with Doppler radar. And that's where he saw his first tornado. He came here in the United States in the 1950s. He didn't see a tornado, even though he was the world's expert on the subject, having surveyed their aftermath. He didn't see his first tornado till the early 1980s. And he was out in Colorado. And I said to him, I said, Dr. Fujita, when you look back on your career, when you retire, what would you like to accomplish? What of significance do you feel you would like to have accomplished? And he said, if I can prevent plane crashes due to wind shear, then I will have felt my lifetime of work was worth it. And he did so much more than that. But he actually is the guy who found out. He, first of all, encouraged the federal government to put Doppler radars in at all major airports so that we can see microbursts. And these plane crashes, when you have a wind shear thing, they only last 2 minutes. He would make the point, if you could see one of those occurring, shut the airport down, landings and takeoffs for 2 minutes, you'd avoid a plane crash and not really screw up the entire operation of the airport. Well, you never hear about plane crashes due to wind shear anymore. Wind shears occur when air drops out of a thunderstorm cloud. Tornadoes occur when air is being sucked up into the cloud. But microbursts happen when air falls out of the cloud. It hits the ground and sprays out in all directions. And we on the ground think that's a straight line wind coming at us. But Fujita used to liken it to a garden hose with water running. He said, if you take that garden hose and you point it at the ground, the flow of water is going to hit the ground. And when it hits the ground, it sprays out in all directions. He said, that's what happens in a wind shear. And, and these were the kinds of things that we were able to share with people in a forum like Fermilab, in our tornado seminars every year. And it was, I have people to this day come up to me and say, we went to your Fermilab tornado seminars.
That's
This is
amazing.
decades
So
after we last did one.
let's talk about legacy for a second. You were a beloved figure in Chicago. Everybody knows Tom Skilling from Chicago and all around. You're an influence on a whole generation of TV meteorologists. They want to be meteorologists because of you. What do you want your legacy? Because I feel like it's more about the science and about making the public aware of the science and being an advocate and an ambassador for weather science. What would you say?
I didn't set up specifically to be a science educator. It's just that in order to communicate what I saw going on or was going to go on, I had to get into some of the nuts and bolts. And so it was just a means of communicating what I found kind of fascinating about the whole thing. And I thought the viewers might too. And it turns out I think they did. You know, when I came to WGN, we were still painting weather maps on a wall. And the Milwaukee station I'd left came back to me and offered me the job again. And I thought, well, that's a smaller market, but I thought, what the heck? If they're offering, I said, would you computerize? This is before computer graphics were widespread used. And I said to them, would you pop for a computer graphics system? Because that's the way we're going in meteorology and weather presentation. They said, yeah. So I remember I came back to Chicago and I told Paul Davis, they offered me the job back at 2.5 times the pay, and I'd be in charge of the whole weather operation and all. And they're going to put a computer graphics system in. And Paul said to me, well, what makes you think we won't do that? He said, I'll tell you what, if you agree to re-up with us and stay, you and I are going to go to RTNDA conferences, radio, television, news directors, and we're going to talk to all these vendors, and we're going to pick out a system, and we're going to computerize. We were 3 years ahead of anybody else in Chicago doing that, using computer graphics. And it was hard because those systems were bug-ridden. And I wanted to animate how the weather was going to, I wanted to show how the jet stream was going to change, how air masses were going to move. I worked opposite a guy in Jacksonville, Florida, who used to try that on film back when we were processing film in-house. And I thought, that's in its natural state. This atmosphere is on the move. It's not a single map, stuck in time. You want to show how it is the storm now in Texas is going to move up and how its precipitation area is going to blow up and ultimately affect our area. So that was what we did. We computerized, but oh my God, I often said if I ever met Bill Gates, I'd have had some real words for him because it was on top of a Windows platform. And, among the things they didn't tell you is when the drive was full. So I'd work 8 hours putting shows together and my animations and all. And I'd go to play them and they were gone. And Windows didn't tell you that you had exceeded the disk space. Here's another bit that's interesting. We were on the satellite at the time. And so people started looking at our moving weather maps and they would call Paul Davis and my news director and say, what system is it that you used? And he said, we worked with Kavoris out of Minneapolis, St. Paul. The reason I like them is because a lot of their people came out of the University of Wisconsin satellite effort. And I thought, this is the way we're going. And these people are going to produce a graphics system that'll be state of the art. And so we went with their system. So Paul would say, well, we're using the Kavoris system, and these stations would shell out money for a Kavoris system, and then they would call him back in a couple of months and say, now, wait a minute, we see Skilling moving things across the screen. Our guy can't get that to happen. And we'd laugh. I'd say, well, that's because their guy wasn't taking 6 or 8 hours to try to use this difficult to use software to try and get movement in there. I mean, it was a hell of a thing to work with, but we got it to work. And I often said that we succeeded despite the technology, not because of it. It was,
Right.
and I know you again as news director would understand that because I mean we computerized so many things from our
Uh,
teleprompting to our news package editing and all the rest. These all depend on computers, each with their own set of idiosyncrasies, and so it was quite interesting.
so, what wisdom or advice would you give to meteorologists working today, or people who want to move into that TV meteorology world?
Well, the first thing, Jason, I am worried to death about the integrity of our meteorological system in this country. What they are proposing, the cutbacks in research, uh, are horrendous. They are ill-advised and dangerous. And we have a working weather system. My philosophy is if it ain't broke, why fix it? This is not broke. It's not wasteful. It's not overstaffed. If anything, the Weather Service has been understaffed, and the sheer dedication of the employees that dominate the scene in the Weather Service is the reason the system works. But also, the prudent use of research and production boosting technology that's been incorporated throughout my entire half century in this business has been thoughtful, well planned, and really a very prudent use of funds. What they are doing,
And saved lives.
they have. Forecast today, whether the public will admit it or not. If I had a dime for every time somebody said, if I could, I wish I had a job where I could be wrong every day and keep my
Yeah,
employment.
yeah, yeah.
And I told him, I said, I wish I had a job like that too. I said, if you think would get on the air every night and lie to you and misrepresent what the weather's going to do and keep my job, I said, I'd be ushered out the door so fast, I wouldn't have time to say what the hell is going on as I'm being ushered out the front door. That's not true. Weather forecasts today are not perfect. This is a very, very complex system, more so in some areas than others because of terrain effects. But weather forecasting has never been better than it is. They're going to shut down the NOAA Oceanographic and Meteorological Lab at Key Biscayne, Florida, where they do a lot of the work with the hurricane hunters and have been actively working to improve modeling and intensification modeling of these hurricanes, which are intensifying more rapidly than ever before as our oceans warm up. They're just zeroing it out. This is ridiculous. It is just ridiculous. And I'm telling you, our profession and young people going into it are going to be affected by this if we let this go. It worries me.
Well,
But
thank you for standing up for science and being an advocate for it, because you're someone people will listen to too. So thank you for that.
well, thanks, Jason. I'll tell you, I'm grateful to have a platform. I mean, our job in mass media, we can get the word out on this. People are busy with their lives. They're trying to put a roof over their heads, educate and clothe their children, and live their lives, and they don't have time to be following what's going on in the bowels of scientific institutions. But we better make them aware of it because this is dangerous, what they're doing. Beyond that, though, Jason, I would say to young people, go for it. I always tell my interns, be too dumb to know you're not supposed to be able to do what you want to do and try for, go for it, try, and love it. We work too many hours in our lives at our jobs. To do something that we don't truly love and have a passion toward is a tragedy. And if you do something you love, and a lot of people go into weather, this is something they've had since childhood, the love and passion they've had since childhood. Go for it. These are the kind of people we want up communicating to the public and everything else.
Well, I think that's a great place to end. So thank you for that. The weird, the warnings, but also the hope and the positive hope for the positive future.
Jason, I've got to tell you, it's always fun to talk to a colleague, and how nice. I haven't had a chance to meet you before this, but thank you. I'm flattered you'd ask me to get involved in this. I hope I wasn't rambling too much, but at any rate, a pleasure to meet you.
Well, you too. Thank you so much. I appreciate the time. Well, he's a lot of fun. I bet you understand now why people watched him. He's very good at explaining complicated weather issues, and he's been geeking out over weather for over 60 years. That's pretty cool. On the next episode, former KCAL anchor and reporter Lena Wen has had a productive and busy life after news. She taught English on YouTube. She hosted a podcast on alternative sexual lifestyles and is now making a killing helping people with financial planning. As always, listen, watch, and subscribe. Everything is now on our website, lifeafternews.com. Please give us good reviews. You can follow me on Instagram at Mr. Jason Ball or at Life After News Pod. New episodes every Tuesday. If you like the show, share it with a friend.